Before Europe burned, Germany was already an invisible training ground. Under red flags and speeches promising greatness, a country was built where work became a sacred duty, childhood military preparation, the home a factory for future soldiers, and leisure an act of collective obedience. Without the need for mass prisons on every corner, fear settled in homes, propaganda in dreams, and war on the horizon. This is how an entire people was led, step by step, from the hope of reconstruction to the total surrender of their bodies and wills to the state. A country on the move when Germany showed its new face to the world. In the early hours of the morning in 1936, Berlin was already throbbing with a perfectly coordinated choreography. From lampposts, government-installed loudspeakers blared military marches, setting the daily rhythm for workers heading to the factories. On the main streets, long rows of swastika flags hung from public buildings, shops, and private homes. Red, white, and black were repeated like a mandatory code, covering every visible corner. Any window without a flag stood out as a suspicious absence. In urban centers like Hamburg, Munich, and Nuremberg, parades were frequent. They weren't reserved only for patriotic holidays. They appeared whenever a party organization presented new members, inaugurated a building, or celebrated an increase in steel production. Military bands led the parades, followed by ranks of SA soldiers marching in close formation. Their leather boots clanged against the asphalt like sharp thumps, a reminder of the discipline of the new order. Behind them came banners, trucks painted with slogans, and, in some cases, mobile loudspeakers repeating the Führer's pronouncements. The facades of public buildings were modified to convey strength and authority. Post offices, railway stations, and administrative headquarters incorporated giant eagles perched on swastikas. The regime's new structures were built in a monumental style, with imposing columns and open spaces designed for mass gatherings. Squares that had once hosted local fairs now became the venues for political rallies where thousands of people raised their right arms in unison when a speaker shouted the Führer's name. In several cities, construction workers were employed on gigantic projects like the Autobahnen, the new state highways. By 1936, hundreds of kilometers had already been opened and thousands more were planned. These highways, presented as a symbol of German progress, were filmed from the air for newsreels shown in cinemas. The images showed vehicles advancing uninterrupted along perfectly straight routes surrounded by fields, as if the entire nation were heading toward an unstoppable future. Public order was carefully monitored by uniformed police and SS units deployed at strategic points. Their role was not limited to security, their mere presence conveyed authority. At train stations, busy intersections, and in front of government buildings, men in black uniforms stood motionless, observing with serious expressions. Although many arrests occurred discreetly, the fear of being identified as a critic discouraged any protest or outspoken commentary. Shops, cafes, and schools displayed posters with slogans like "Germany is awakening" or "One people, one leader, one Reich." Newspapers published statistics on industrial growth and the country's supposed spiritual recovery. Photo essays showed smiling workers in newly opened factories posing next to modern machinery decorated with party flags. The image of a revived nation was disseminated daily and repeated in cinemas through newsreels that showed the Führer visiting construction sites, greeting workers, or walking among ranks of soldiers. In some middle-class neighborhoods, residents' associations were run by party members who oversaw compliance with unwritten rules. Displaying national symbols was mandatory at celebrations, participating in public events was considered a show of patriotism, and attendance at radio broadcasts was organized collectively. Households that did not yet own a radio were encouraged to buy an inexpensive version marketed as the People's Receiver, designed to pick up only government-approved frequencies. Every Saturday afternoon in many cities, trains and buses transported groups of workers to party rallies. Families lined the route and watched as not only armed men marched by, but also groups of uniformed young people belonging to youth organizations. The salute with the right arm extended became an everyday gesture used to greet superiors, respond at events, and even, in some cases, to replace traditional social greetings. In rural areas, local party offices organized village meetings where short films were shown, highlighting the regime's achievements and the promises of a strong and respected Germany. Farmers were presented as pillars of national identity. and their image was exalted as a symbol of the people's purity and strength. Posters depicting Aryan peasants holding ears of wheat under clear skies were printed, accompanied by slogans that glorified the connection between blood, land, and nation. In the schoolyards, students participated in weekly ceremonies where they sang patriotic hymns before entering their classrooms. A portrait of the Führer hung in each classroom alongside the Reich flag. Teachers were required to begin lessons with references to the National Socialist spirit and link educational content to values such as obedience, racial unity, and sacrifice for the fatherland. Students recited memorized slogans and participated in physical exercises designed to strengthen their bodies and prepare them for military service. In the factories, before the shifts began, some supervisors lined up the workers to listen to short speeches about national production goals. Industrial posters highlighted the increase in production as a collective victory. On certain days, high-ranking officials visited the plants to congratulate them publicly, while photographers captured the moment. At the end of the shifts, patriotic songs were played over the loudspeakers. The regime's visual aesthetic sought to saturate all public spaces. Rigid typography, intense colors, and imperial emblems replaced all previous graphic design. Propaganda posters were frequently updated to ensure the population never stopped seeing them. The walls of train stations and parks were covered with images of marching soldiers or the Führer gazing toward the horizon. Language was also transformed. Expressions like community of the people, traitor, enemy within, and national spirit became part of everyday conversations, school speeches, and business slogans. Radio and newspapers repeated official phrases that people began to unconsciously adopt. Speaking in terms foreign to the party's discourse could arouse suspicion or elicit uncomfortable looks. At massive events like Labor Day or the party celebrations in Nuremberg, thousands of Germans traveled on specially organized trains to witness the spectacles. The perfectly synchronized parades, the use of torchlight at night, and the amplified voices of the leaders speaking to the crowds produced a sense of collective strength that quickly spread to those watching these events from other cities via newsreels. In small towns, residents lined up outside shops to watch columns of young people wearing armbands and carrying party emblems march past toward community centers. Local bands played martial tunes while the older generation watched in silence. Children mimed the marching steps and practiced military salutes amid laughter. The changes were so visible that even those not actively involved knew their surroundings had taken on a new public identity. The feeling of constant movement was reinforced by repeated announcements about new projects, formed battalions, open roads, and speeches that spoke of a victorious future. Daily life, from a workday to a trip to the movies, was permeated with symbols, discipline, and messages that eliminated any doubt about the country's direction. Every city, every factory, and every school was presented as an active part of a national machine that moved relentlessly forward in a single direction. Work for all, the end of unemployment and work discipline. At dawn in 1936, thousands of workers crossed the metal gates of the newly reopened factories, carrying lunchboxes and tools marked with the emblem of the German Labour Front. The sound of factory sirens signaled the start of the shifts, while uniformed foremen supervised the entrance, lists in hand. Where once there had been signs reading "Job Wanted," banners now displayed the slogan, "Work is honor, work builds the Reich." Official figures released by the regime claimed that unemployment, which in 1932 had exceeded 6 million, had fallen to just over 1 million by 1936. Newspapers repeated these figures daily, accompanied by photographs of long columns of workers marching under official banners on their way to work. Jobs came with discipline. Factories, expanded by state economic plans, were refurbished with flags, loudspeakers, and bulletin boards displaying production lists. The names of the most productive workers appeared on posters bearing party symbols. Some supervisors required workers to line up briefly before starting the machines to hear slogans about national effort. Silence during working hours was interpreted as a sign of collective discipline. Inappropriate conversations could lead to internal reports that jeopardized an employee's job security. In the open fields, young men between the ages of 18 and 25 worked with shovels as part of the Reichsarbeitsdienst, ARAD, the Reich Labor Service. They wore brown uniforms, lived in communal barracks, and worked full days digging ditches, building rural roads, and working on agricultural projects. Before breakfast, they performed physical exercises in formation. In the evening, they attended lectures on national duties. The service, initially voluntary, became compulsory as a prerequisite for military service. By 1936, tens of thousands of young men spent weeks at a time wielding tools while singing songs about strength and obedience. Industrial expansion was directly linked to military preparations. Metallurgical companies and machine shops received government contracts to produce components for rearmament. Production of steel, aluminum, trucks and mechanical parts increased. In several cities, medium-sized workshops were absorbed by large corporations designated as essential to the state. Workers were ordered to accelerate production rates, justified as necessary for national defense. Even civilian companies, such as refrigerator and motorcycle manufacturers, were partially redirected to the production of war material disguised as agricultural machinery. Working hours gradually lengthened. 10 to 12-hour days became common in strategic sectors. Wages remained regulated and barely increased, but access to employment was defended as a privilege that had to be repaid with loyalty. The possibility of losing one's job for showing dissatisfaction or laziness became a form of economic coercion. Control of wages and working conditions was centralized by the German Labour Front, which completely replaced the old trade unions. Strikes were prohibited, and any attempt at resistance was considered sabotage against the state. The German Labour Front organized working life with a paramilitary structure. Party representatives entered factories and led assemblies to instill in employees the idea that they worked not for an employer, but for the nation. Companies held ceremonies upon reaching certain production levels, and those who excelled not so much in individual technical efficiency, but in ideological devotion were rewarded. Work was declared a moral unity where the individual was to disappear within the productive mass of the Reich. During breaks, leaflets were distributed showing the Führer visiting construction sites, smiling alongside workers, or inspecting public works. Radio broadcasts emphasized that those employed were part of a historic mission. Newspaper clippings comparing unemployment in the Weimar Republic with the full recovery under the new regime were displayed in many warehouses and homes. Graphs showed sharp drops in the number of unemployed as proof of the new system's superiority. In several working-class neighborhoods, ceremonies were held where picks and shovels were symbolically presented to citizens entering the workforce. The young men were introduced to the community as exemplary future workers. The speeches repeatedly stated that the human body should be placed at the service of the people, both with tools and with weapons if necessary. Families watched these events, seeing their children join ranks that marched in unison after receiving their uniforms. One of the most widespread symbols of this work culture was the promise of the people's car. Scale models of the vehicle were displayed in public showcases, presented as a future reward for those who supported the economic plans. Although mass production had not yet begun, thousands of workers enrolled in special state-run savings plans, contributing part of their wages in the hope of one day receiving the car. Radio and newspaper advertisements showed smiling families envisioning a future where they would travel on the new highways built thanks to their collective effort. Labor inspections were conducted with increasing frequency. In many factories, government-appointed inspectors checked whether employees displayed enthusiasm and whether the facilities properly displayed national symbols. Minor errors or delays were publicly singled out as examples of reprehensible behavior. Infraction lists were posted near time clocks. Even tardiness was linked to a supposed lack of patriotic commitment. This surveillance created an atmosphere of constant alertness in the workplace. The official discourse proclaimed that every job was an act of contribution to the national community. Workers were portrayed as industrial soldiers. Images were circulated of workers raising hammers in a pose similar to a soldier with a rifle. In armaments factories, some workshops were decorated like barracks, with slogans painted on the walls equating producing metal parts with serving on the front lines. In rural areas, the mechanization of certain agricultural tasks was presented as a sign of progress. The state provided tools and machinery to farmers approved by local authorities. In return, farmers were required to increase production levels and participate in rituals organized to celebrate collective effort. During harvest time, youth brigades were sent to work in fields lacking sufficient labor. In industrial cities like Essen, Bremen, and Chemnitz, the rhythm of work dictated daily life. Restaurants and shops adapted their hours to factory shifts. The sale of alcohol was prohibited during certain hours to prevent absenteeism. Some companies implemented mandatory morning exercise under the supervision of party officials. Factories began installing communal canteens where basic menus regulated by the state were served. Success in obtaining employment became a source of ideological identification. Many workers participated in marches with banners that read, "Thanks to the Führer, I have a job." At public events, workers were placed on special platforms as living examples of the new Germany. Images of these men in work uniforms and armbands were reproduced as a symbol of the worker redeemed after years of misery. The labor system not only ordered the economy but also bodies. Punctuality, obedience, and physical endurance became criteria of social value. The figure of the resilient worker replaced the critical citizen. Routine became discipline, discipline became duty, and duty became collective identity. Total control of education and youth. At 8 o'clock sharp, the schoolyard bell rang with almost military precision. The students formed lines, arms outstretched to maintain the exact distance between classmates. In the center of the yard, the Reich flag waved, and a gold-framed portrait of the Führer hung above the building's main entrance. A teacher raised his hand, and the children saluted in unison. Then they all sang the national anthem before going to their classrooms. It was a ritual repeated every morning in every school in Germany since the beginning of 1936. Education had become an instrument of the state. Schools, once diverse and decentralized, were standardized under a single curriculum designed to mold children according to the values of National Socialism. Mathematics was taught through problems involving marching soldiers or bombs being launched in perfect trajectories. In biology, textbooks described racial purity as a natural principle, and geography maps highlighted the lost territories that Germany was to reclaim. The goal was not merely to instruct, but to create a new generation that thought, spoke, and felt in a uniform manner. Youth were monitored with the same intensity as the economy. The Hitler Youth spread like a net, ensnaring millions of young people of both sexes. In every neighborhood, party offices organized weekly meetings. The boys wore brown shirts, black scarves, and swastika armbands. The girls of the Bund Deutscher Mädel wore white blouses and navy blue skirts. By the age of 14, belonging to these organizations was no longer a choice, but an obligation. On weekends, the streets filled with columns of young people marching to training camps, singing songs about strength, loyalty, and sacrifice. Physical training was central to the curriculum. In parks and open fields, instructors made the teenagers run until they were exhausted. They learned to navigate with compasses, build shelters, pitch tents, and crawl through mud. In the summer months, they were sent to camps where they slept in communal tents, stood night watches, and attended lectures on obedience and discipline. There, they openly discussed the destiny that awaited each young person, service in the army or in the home, depending on their gender. Military preparation no longer began in the barracks, but at school. School textbooks were completely rewritten. Almost all texts published before 1933 were withdrawn from circulation. Publishers received precise instructions regarding authorized content. Literature subjects were revised to eliminate authors considered degenerate or cosmopolitan. History lessons glorified past German victories and omitted defeats. In art classes, students were taught to draw Reich symbols and heroic portraits. Even nursery rhymes were replaced with patriotic tunes. Biology textbooks featured illustrations comparing superior and inferior races, with captions explaining the need to preserve German purity. The purge of teachers accompanied this process. Thousands of teachers were dismissed, forced into early retirement, or transferred. Teachers were required to swear personal loyalty to the Führer and attend indoctrination courses organized by the party. Those who resisted were replaced by young instructors trained in National Socialist academies. In many schools, the new teachers arrived in uniforms, armbands, and with unquestionable authority. Some of the former teachers continued to teach, but under strict supervision. Any deviation from the curriculum could be reported by the students themselves, who were encouraged to report suspicious behavior. In universities, ideological control was even more severe. Student centers were reorganized under party supervision. Scientific research was subordinated to racial policy. Entire laboratories and departments were dedicated to justifying eugenic theories. Faculties of philosophy and sociology reduced their activity, while technical, medical, and engineering courses expanded with state support. Professors were required to begin each class with the Nazi salute, and public lectures were devoted to topics related to the Reich's historical mission. Libraries removed thousands of volumes deemed undesirable, and lists of banned authors were updated annually. The rituals of the Nazi salute were seamlessly integrated into school life. Upon entering the classroom, students raised their arms and shouted "Heil Hitler" to the teacher. During recess, short marches were organized around the playground. The salute replaced everyday gestures, becoming a mechanical reflex. At school festivals, children paraded before parents and local authorities under banners decorated with party emblems. Sports competitions were also transformed into displays of collective discipline. The winners were presented as examples of Aryan youth, strong, obedient, and healthy. The separation between boys and girls intensified. Boys were trained in resistance, strategy, and leadership. Girls in domestic tasks, childcare, and family morality. Girls' classes taught basic nutrition, sewing, and first aid, along with lectures on motherhood and purity. In the female Hitler Youth, girls participated in physical activities, but always under the ideal of preparing them to be mothers for the future army. The regime promoted the image of women as the biological and emotional backbone of the people, while men were molded as their armed defenders. Youth became the emotional center of the state. National holidays were dominated by uniformed teenagers marching before massive crowds. On German Youth Day, squares thronged with thousands of young people carrying torches and flags. In speeches, they were referred to as the generation of steel, destined to ensure the Reich's eternal existence. Younger children looked up in admiration to their elders, eager for their turn to wear the same uniforms. The hierarchical structure mirrored that of the party: youth leaders, instructors, and supervisors, all under absolute command. Obedience was taught as a natural virtue. In many homes, parents noticed the change. Their children spoke using phrases borrowed from radio broadcasts. Some corrected their elders if they expressed doubts about the government's measures. Songs from the youth movement echoed through the streets, replacing traditional melodies. On Sundays, instead of family gatherings, group exercises or excursions were organized under party banners. The state had managed to displace the influence of family, religion, and community, occupying every aspect of young people's free time. The effect was visible even in clothing. In the streets, youth uniforms mingled with work clothes and military fatigues. Schools became breeding grounds for soldiers and model mothers. Students learned to recognize the sound of national anthems before they could read sheet music. Graduation ceremonies included oaths of loyalty to the Führer. At universities, new graduates were congratulated not for their knowledge, but for their fighting spirit. Education no longer formed individuals, but cogs in a collective machine. By the end of 1936, the process of control was complete. Every German child had been registered with state organizations, every school was under ideological supervision, and every teacher answered to the party's hierarchical chain of command. The classroom, the playground, and the summer camp had all merged into a single, invisible institution, the totalitarian state. Childhood and youth, once the domain of families, were now the property of the Reich. The German home, family, gender, and birth rate. On the morning of August 12, 1939, at the Kroll Theatre in Berlin, a line of women dressed in traditional costumes slowly made their way to the stage. Gold, silver, or bronze crosses gleamed on their chests. They were the mothers of the Reich, recipients of the Mutterkreuz, the German Mother's Cross of Honor. Hitler himself had decreed that women who bore 4, 6, or 8 children deserved decorations for patriotic merit. This was not a symbolic gesture. The German state had transformed motherhood into a state function. The regime had understood that control of the home was as essential as control of industry or the army. From 1933 onward, the Ministry of Propaganda and the National Socialist Women's League had launched a vast campaign to redefine the female role. Posters depicted women smiling among blonde children, holding bread, or working in the garden. Their mission was not professional competition, but the biological perpetuation of the nation. The ideal of the emancipated woman of the Weimar Republic was eliminated. Professional women, teachers, and civil servants were dismissed or forced into marriage. In their place, the state exalted the ideal of the submissive and fertile wife, guardian of the home and mother of future soldiers. The incentive was both economic and moral. Marriage loans offered 1,000 marks to each newlywed couple, with 25% of the debt forgiven for each child born. The policy functioned as a powerful tool of social control. In less than 5 years, over 1 million families had applied for the loans and birth rates rose noticeably. Every birth was registered and celebrated as a contribution to the renewal of the Volk. The Lebensborn ceremonies, the maternity homes organized by the SS, ensured the care of racially pure mothers. In these centers, women were selected based on ancestry and health, and the children were considered the property of the state. The home was reorganized as a political institution. In every neighborhood, inspectors from the German Women's Front monitored the cleanliness, order, and morals of families. They visited homes, checked the books, and advised wives on domestic economy, nutrition, and childcare. It wasn't assistance, but a form of civil surveillance. In May Day parades, mothers with strollers decorated with flags marched alongside the workers. Births became public events. Civil registries sent notifications to local newspapers, and radio stations broadcast congratulatory messages. Maternity wards became temples where the race was honored. The ideal of the Aryan family was simple: a soldier father, a devoted mother, and healthy children. Any deviation was suspect. Mixed marriages between Aryans and Jews were outlawed by the Nuremberg laws of 1935. Doctors were required to report hereditary diseases or malformations. Blood purity became a legal requirement for marriage. Marriage applications were reviewed by party officials who approved or rejected unions based on racial criteria. The state infiltrated the most intimate sphere, transforming the choice of partner into a matter of national service. The discourse surrounding procreation was omnipresent. At youth parades, speeches by female leaders reminded everyone that every empty cradle was a betrayal of the fatherland. Newspapers published birth statistics alongside industrial production figures, as if both indicators measured the same national strength. Mothers with many children were publicly celebrated. Single or childless women were viewed with suspicion. In factories, female workers received maternity leave, but also regular inspections of their moral conduct. Marriage ceased to be a private matter. It was a biological contract with the Reich. Domestic education was elevated to a political duty. Manuals for women's training taught efficient cooking, waste-free household management, and how to raise children in the values of National Socialism. Courses offered by the Reich Women's League included concepts of racial hygiene, personal hygiene, and the selection of Germanic foods. Traditional recipes were promoted as symbols of identity. Every home was expected to reflect order, purity, and discipline. Slogans about maternal duty and family unity hung on the walls alongside Hitler's portrait. The kitchen, the dining room, and the nursery became spaces for daily indoctrination. Family morality was controlled with the same meticulousness as industrial production. Divorces decreased dramatically thanks to new legal restrictions. Male infidelity was tolerated if it contributed to the expansion of the race, while female infidelity was harshly prosecuted. The once popular tabloid press was censored and replaced by magazines showcasing examples of exemplary homes. Religious holidays were replaced by secular celebrations. German Mother's Day and National Marriage Day were instituted to strengthen ties with the state. In each ceremony, the Reich flag replaced the crucifix. Control extended even to childhood. Births were registered in party offices, where officials decided on acceptable names based on their Germanic origin. Labour Front nurseries cared for the children of workers while their parents contributed to the Reich's economy. In rural areas, midwives were state agents, tasked with reporting genetic irregularities or ideological deviations. Families who failed to meet expectations were excluded from benefits or ostracized by their neighbors. In small towns, home inspections were frequent, and an anonymous denunciation was enough to initiate an investigation. The home was used as a symbol in propaganda. Films and newsreels showed bright houses, tidy gardens, and robust children. In every image, the mother appeared as the moral pillar of the nation. Simplicity, cleanliness, and sacrifice were extolled. Radio broadcast advice on motherhood, economical recipes, and stories of heroic mothers who sent their children to the front. The slogan Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, was replaced by Kinder, Küche, Vaterland. Faith had been replaced by patriotism. Conjugal love was transformed into political love. Household symbols were also appropriated. Traditional weddings incorporated the Nazi salute and oaths of allegiance to the Führer. Instead of wedding rings blessed by priests, the bride and groom received official certificates from the party. Family ceremonies, from baptisms to birthdays, were held under swastika flags. Eldest children swore allegiance to the Reich in front of their parents. The family was no longer a private refuge, but a small state under surveillance. By the end of 1936, the model was consolidated. Women had been removed from the public sphere and transformed into essential cogs in the demographic machine. The German home functioned as a cell for producing loyalty, control, and life. Every cradle was a political triumph, every family table an extension of the party. Motherhood ceased to be a choice and became a national duty. The Reich had found in the family not only a symbol, but a weapon of permanence. Sports, art, and entertainment under surveillance. The local stadium was packed before dawn. Thousands of young men in shorts and white t-shirts waited in line on the damp grass. A loudspeaker announced the start of the state parade. Each group marched forward in perfect formation, flexing their arms with martial rigidity. They were not mere athletes, they represented bodies disciplined by the regime. In the stands, flags hung among posters proclaiming physical strength as a national duty. Sport had become a tool of collective control. The regime infiltrated physical exercise into all social classes. Athletic competitions ceased to be civilian entertainment and became part of military service preparation. In schools, students ran, jumped, and performed gymnastic exercises under the supervision of instructors who assessed their stamina. In factories, tournaments were organized among workers where physical performance was publicly measured and compared. Regional championships showcased upright young men with determined expressions, trained not to triumph as individuals but to demonstrate the power of the national body. Football and track and field were extolled as examples of collective coordination, while sports considered soft were marginalized. The Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy program completely reorganized leisure time. Millions of workers enrolled in this state-run program that promised organized and accessible entertainment. Trips, concerts, excursions, and recreational activities were included in schedules regulated by the German Labour Front. Workers no longer chose how to relax. The state designed their leisure time. In factories, weekly programs were advertised where every employee could participate in group walks, bowling tournaments, or collective choirs. The goal was not only to provide entertainment, but also to prevent leisure time from generating critical thinking or ideological deviations. Organized vacations were transformed into propaganda tools. Cruise ships like the Wilhelm Gustloff departed packed with uniformed workers in sportswear, photographed smiling as they sang patriotic songs on deck. In state-built resorts, such as the gigantic Prora seaside resort on the Baltic coast, identical dormitories housed thousands of vacationers who ate breakfasts simultaneously, moved through endless corridors, and listened to loudspeaker messages about national unity. The beaches became the stage for collective exercises at dawn, with lines of bathers stretching under the supervision of party instructors. Relaxation became a choreographed ceremony. Cinema played a crucial role in emotional indoctrination. Theaters, packed night after night, screened official newsreels showcasing public works, massive parades, and purported stories of labor success. Commercial films were carefully filtered. Even romantic dramas included messages of sacrifice for the nation, obedience, and collective destiny. In historical productions, Germanic heroes bravely fought against foreign enemies, promoting a narrative of ancestral grandeur. Laughter and tears were guided by the plot in a single emotional direction. Viewers left the theater with images of gigantic parades and idealized landscapes of the homeland still projected in their minds. Theatre and music were subjected to strict control. Plays that did not extol heroic values were withdrawn, and theatres were forced to program historical dramas, war epics, and moralistic performances. Operas glorifying Germanic myths were reinstated as an essential part of national identity. Orchestras played hymns and solemn compositions at public events, while modern music was declared dangerous or un-Germanic. Popular concerts were transformed into collective acts where the audience rose at certain points to sing official chants. Musical culture ceased to be an artistic expression and became a choreographed tool of the national spirit. Modern art was declared an ideological enemy. Expressionist paintings, abstract sculptures, and experimental works were labeled degenerate. Entire museums were dismantled and their collections confiscated or destroyed. In their place, realistic depictions of robust peasants, heroic soldiers, and fertile mothers with children were promoted. Artists who wished to continue working had to adapt to the new official style. Clearly delineated figures, scenes of collective work, muscular bodies, and gestures of determination. The walls of public buildings were covered with murals depicting lines of marching youths or peasants ploughing the land in perfect harmony. Creativity was replaced by aesthetic obedience. Mass festivals became state rituals. Thousands gathered in stadiums, squares, or torchlit esplanades for nightly ceremonies where party leaders delivered speeches. The lights would suddenly go out, and when they came back on, thousands of torches formed giant figures visible from the air. The rallies were meticulously organized. Every participant knew their place, every clap was timed, and every slogan was repeated in a synchronized roar. Music set the rhythm for the speeches, and collective silence preceded each phrase spoken from the stands. The crowd did not disperse. It was a compact mass, molded to act as a single organism. In the cities, Sundays were no longer days of leisure, but rather days of community participation. Families were invited to attend public concerts, traveling exhibitions, or large-scale sporting events. Parks were filled with group gymnastics, where entire groups of children, teenagers, and adults exercised to the rhythm of drums. Neighborhoods competed with each other to demonstrate the greatest discipline and enthusiasm. Attendance was recorded by local supervisors who evaluated the civic participation of the residents. Leisure ceased to be spontaneous and became a constant social obligation. The population accepted these structures as a natural part of daily life. A worker might spend the week at the factory, Saturday at a collective recreational activity, and Sunday at a cultural ceremony organized by the party. Recreation was always observed, directed, and evaluated. Smiles on newsreels showed happy masses. Individual gestures disappeared amidst the sea of neatly arranged uniforms. Photographs of KDF cruises or youth festivals showed bodies in constant motion under a single flag. By the end of 1936, leisure time had been completely absorbed by the state. Sport was no longer play, but martial drill. Holidays were an act of collective obedience. Cinema taught acceptable sentiments. Art displayed perfect bodies and fertile mothers. Theater stages repeated stories of heroic sacrifice. Public squares were the stage for mass rituals. Entertainment was permitted only if it served to unite, discipline, and prepare. The Reich not only controlled work and school, it had conquered even moments of laughter, rest, and song. The invisible social control in Nazi Germany. The door to the second-floor apartment slammed shut. The neighbors fell silent for a moment. No one knew for sure what had happened, but everyone had heard the heavy footsteps coming up the stairs and the brief, hushed conversation before the arrest. Minutes later, a tense silence hung over the building. No one asked any questions. No one said a word. That night, the apartment window remained dark. The next day, at the lobby, someone said the detainee had been brought in to clarify certain comments. No one wanted to know more. Civilian denunciations turned suspicion into the norm. In neighborhoods and factories, it was enough for someone to be singled out for speaking ambiguously about the regime to attract attention. Anonymous letters denouncing neighbors, co-workers, or even family members circulated frequently. In some cities, mailboxes for patriotic notifications were installed, where citizens could report disloyal behavior. In rural areas, conversations in taverns were monitored by party informants. The state no longer needed to listen to every conversation. The population was watching on its behalf. A single ill-chosen word in public could end in a nighttime visit. The early concentration camps served as a warning. Places like Dachau received the first political prisoners, communists, social democrats, or outspoken critics of the regime. Not everyone who entered was executed. Many returned after weeks of beatings, forced labor, and humiliation. Their return had a purpose: to show what happened to those who deviated. The physical marks, the subsequent silence, and the changes in their behavior became living testimonies. Rumors about the punishments circulated more effectively than any official statement. The very existence of the camp acted as a psychological barrier. The repression against political opponents silently extended to religious figures, intellectuals, and even ordinary people who refused to submit to public rituals. Some priests were arrested for refusing to replace religious symbols with state flags. Christian youth leaders disappeared after insisting on holding spiritual gatherings outside official control. Some workers were arrested for refusing to salute at public events. The repression made no distinction between ideologies when it came to challenging total obedience. Even those who did not belong to any opposition group could be labeled enemies of the people if their behavior did not align with collective expectations. Control of correspondence reinforced social isolation. Letters were reviewed at selected post offices, where trained employees detected ambiguous phrases or veiled criticism. Some citizens began to write impersonally, avoiding the expression of private emotions. Telephone calls were subject to eavesdropping in certain districts. Personal diaries were hidden or destroyed for fear of being found in a surprise inspection. Privacy became a fragile territory. Speaking in hushed tones within one's own home did not guarantee safety, especially when children were raised to repeat state slogans and could innocently comment on what they overheard at home. Humor and criticism were criminalized. Telling jokes about the regime could lead to charges of demoralizing the people. Some people were arrested for comments made during private gatherings. In taverns, certain songs were banned as disrespectful. Even remaining silent during official speeches could be interpreted as a sign of dissent. The line between what was permissible and what was punishable was deliberately blurred. Language was tamed. Every word had to be carefully considered before being spoken. Fear of the consequences replaced spontaneity. Collective paranoia became a weapon of the state. People began to measure their gestures, their facial expressions, and their social interactions. Neighbors stopped trusting each other. Friendships were carefully selected, avoiding deep conversations. Some changed the way they walked, adopting upright postures so as not to appear apathetic. Daily life was transformed into a stage where everyone performed obedience. Even those who sincerely supported the regime took extreme precautions, fearing being mistaken for opponents. Mutual suspicion weakened any possibility of solidarity. Fear no longer came from above, now it resided among the people. In factories, section chiefs reported on workers' suspicious behavior. A worker who showed fatigue or a lack of enthusiasm could be questioned about their moral state. In schools, teachers closely observed students who didn't participate enthusiastically in group singing. Some children reported parents who spoke nostalgically of bygone days. In residential buildings, doormen and superintendents became additional eyes of the system. Surveillance no longer depended on official agents. It flourished within the very structure of society. Nighttime arrests became a symbol of terror. They weren't carried out constantly, nor with the regularity of a widespread policy, but their very existence was enough to keep everyone on edge. The random detentions served as a reminder that anyone could be next. Someone could disappear due to a malicious denunciation, personal rivalries, or misunderstandings. The uncertainty surrounding the selection criteria amplified the fear. Citizens preferred self-censorship to risking attracting suspicion. Preventive detention was applied without trial. People were taken for questioning without legal safeguards, and their continued imprisonment depended on opaque administrative decisions. Some detainees were released after signing declarations of loyalty. Others remained detained indefinitely. The lack of clear procedures created a climate of constant unpredictability. Even an official acquittal did not eliminate the social stigma of having been investigated. The psychological impact was profound. The streets seemed safe, but the safety was perceived as a consequence of total control. There were no visible crimes, but there was a constant fear of unknowingly committing one. People learned to smile at public events, to applaud enthusiastically, and to repeat slogans even when they didn't fully understand them. Fear didn't manifest itself in shouts or protests. It hid behind exaggeratedly loyal gestures. By the end of 1936, repression had transformed society into a self-regulating structure. The Gestapo didn't need to fill the streets with agents. Widespread suspicion acted as an invisible wall. Denunciations replaced cameras. Concentration camps became silent echoes that resonated in every unfinished conversation. Home ceased to be a refuge. Silence became a risk, and unwavering obedience was the only guarantee of remaining invisible to the eyes of the state. The single message in every corner of the Reich. As evening fell, a crowd gathered before a loudspeaker mounted on a metal pole at the street corner. The sound crackled for a few seconds, then began broadcasting a passionate speech about the strength of the people and the nation's destiny. Some passers-by listened, others continued walking, but everyone heard it. There was no way to ignore that voice. It was the Führer's, transmitted across the entire country without interruption. The city air seemed to vibrate to the rhythm of his intonation. Propaganda didn't ask permission. It occupied public space like a command. The Ministry of Propaganda, headed by Joseph Goebbels, functioned as a central hub for coordinating national discourse. Every news item, pamphlet, poster, or public action passed through its offices before reaching the public. Guidelines were sent to newspapers with precise instructions on what headlines to use, what words to avoid, and what tone to adopt. Even silences were planned. Certain topics could not be mentioned, others had to be repeated endlessly. Morning meetings at the ministry determined the prevailing emotional state of the population each day. Radios were weaponized as instruments of ideology. Millions of inexpensive sets, known as people's radios, Volksempfänger, were distributed throughout the country at affordable prices. Families listened to official speeches as part of their daily routine. In factories, loudspeakers were hung above the machines so workers could listen to patriotic slogans. In rural villages, communal listening stations were set up where residents gathered to hear the leader's words. During important events, the broadcast was interrupted to announce that the Führer was speaking, and all work stopped out of respect. Posters plastered walls, train stations, and main streets. The images showed muscular men wielding hammers, soldiers marching with determined expressions, or mothers holding blonde babies. The slogans were short, direct, and repetitive. One people, one Reich, one Führer. Every color, every gesture, every shadow was designed to elicit emotional obedience. The images were repeated so frequently that they became part of the urban landscape. On trains, passengers saw the same posters every morning until they knew them by heart, unable to stop themselves. Propaganda permeated everyday life. In schools, children learned to recite the leader's phrases and drew flags in their notebooks. In public squares, kiosks sold illustrated magazines with heroic tales and photographs of official events. In factories, breaks were taken in front of murals with messages about collective effort. Street markets displayed banners extolling national self-sufficiency. Even streetcar tickets bore inscriptions reminding passengers of their civic duty. The message infiltrated every object, leaving no space untouched by ideological content. Emotional manipulation was systematic. The figure of the hero who sacrificed his life for the people was exalted, and stories of martyrs who had died defending the homeland in past internal conflicts were disseminated. At the same time, clear enemies were constructed: Jews, communists, foreign capitalists, or any group that could pose a threat. Accounts were published in which supposedly treacherous individuals were exposed by vigilant citizens. Emotions were not left to chance. Euphoria, pride, and fear were orchestrated like notes in a national score. Controlled rumors circulated as part of the propaganda machine. Official news programs broadcast future economic or political victories as if they had already occurred. Alleged external conspiracies justified internal control measures. Propaganda did not merely inform, it anticipated, diverted, and shaped the perception of time. Minor events were used to exaggerate an imminent threat or an expanding grandeur. Thus, even without concrete evidence, the population accepted as real what was presented with solemnity and repetition. Truth did not come from facts, but from the voice of the state. The Führer was constructed as a messianic figure. Photographs showed him surrounded by children, greeting workers, or surveying construction projects as if each industrial undertaking were a personal act of will. In speeches, he presented himself as a guide chosen by historical destiny. Propaganda portrayed him as a tireless man, concerned for every citizen, even the humblest. Stories were told of him personally intervening in individual cases to correct injustices. Crowds were filmed weeping as they listened to him. Aerial images of gigantic crowds reinforced the idea that millions were voluntarily uniting under his figure. projecting him as the emotional epicenter of the country. Even the most mundane gestures were politicized. Postcards sent by soldiers in training included official phrases. Shops decorated their windows with flags on special occasions. Family celebrations, such as birthdays or weddings, incorporated obligatory salutes to the leader. Local newspapers dedicated entire sections to highlighting acts of loyalty by ordinary citizens. Every small, everyday action could be transformed into a patriotic example. The individual ceased to convey their own identity. They conveyed an official message. Mass events reinforced this emotional structure. Public speeches in giant stadiums, torchlight parades, and national anniversaries projected images of total unity. Every participant received precise instructions on how to move, clap, or sing. Cameramen captured specific angles that showed perfectly aligned crowds. News reports emphasized the scale of participation rather than the content of the event. Millions of viewers saw the same images, reinforcing the feeling of belonging to a single community with a single possible way of thinking. Propaganda didn't just talk, it taught how to feel. Martial music generated automatic enthusiasm. Heroic tales induced admiration. Deep voices on the news broadcasts created solemnity. Every day was charged with directed emotion. If a citizen woke up apathetic, the morning radio address pushed them to a specific emotion. If they felt tired, billboards along the way reminded them of their duty. If they hesitated, the crowd at public events enveloped them until their individual thoughts were erased. By the end of 1936, propaganda had erased the boundary between the public and the private. It wasn't a message imposed from above. It was dispersed in every sound, every image, every social habit. It wasn't forcibly imposed at every moment because it was already within the collective consciousness. Silence was replaced by slogans. The landscape was occupied by symbols. The word people was repeated until it became a constant presence in every conversation. The message no longer needed to be heard. It became the very atmosphere of the Reich. The militarization of Nazi society. The sound of a whistle cut through the cold morning air. Hundreds of teenagers dressed in Hitler Youth uniforms ran in formation across a damp field as an instructor shouted orders in a martial tone. None of them had yet been officially drafted, but they already moved like a military unit. Their coordinated steps were not a matter of chance. They were the result of years of systematic training. From childhood, education had instilled martial obedience. In schools, physical exercises were reorganized according to criteria of endurance, coordination, and discipline. Maps in geography class highlighted lost borders that must be recovered. History lessons glorified past battles, presenting them as examples of national destiny. Children repeated slogans that linked their identity to preparation for future combat. Even children's games were transformed into simulated patrols, command signals, and small competitions of strength and agility. The Hitler Youth served as the backbone of youth pre-militarization. At age 10, boys entered the German Youth League, Deutsches Jungvolk, where they learned marching, orienteering, basic tool use, and group discipline. At 14, they transferred to the Hitler Youth proper, where the hierarchical structure mimicked that of an armed force. There they were taught basic formation movement tactics, field first aid, and camouflage techniques. Nights in camp included alarm drills and night marches with loaded backpacks. Instructors assessed the young men's ability to obey orders without hesitation, endure fatigue, and act as part of a cohesive unit. Civilian organizations also adopted paramilitary practices. The SA offered parades and baton drills and marching drills for adult regime sympathizers. The NSKK, focused on motorized transport, trained its members in high-speed driving, emergency mechanical repairs, and coordinated convoy movement. These activities, presented as voluntary and recreational, reinforced a sense of belonging to organized units under strict command discipline. Weekends became training days with brief commands, alert positions, and group movement drills. The Reich Labor Service, RAD, served as a bridge between civilian youth and the military. Young men were sent to labor camps where the day began with formation, saluting the standard, and collective exercises. They dug ditches, built roads, and erected structures to the rhythm of military commands. Their uniforms, though lacking military insignia, resembled those of actual military units. They slept in shared barracks, performed rotating guard duty, and attended nightly lectures on national duty and the spirit of sacrifice. The Reidi did not train them to shoot, but it did train them to obey orders and toughen their bodies. The expansion of mandatory military service solidified this process. Generations trained in the youth system entered the army already familiar with hierarchies, command, and physical discipline. The army didn't have to teach marching, it only had to refine techniques. New recruits quickly learned rifle use, trench warfare, and hand-to-hand combat. Training included running while carrying full equipment, crawling under barbed wire, and throwing themselves to the ground at the sound of simulated gunfire. Commanders evaluated not only technical ability, but also the psychological readiness to act under extreme pressure. Mental conditioning for combat was as important as physical conditioning. From the Hitler Youth to the army, the idea was instilled that the individual had no value outside the group. Phrases glorifying sacrifice and ridiculing fear were repeated. Songs spoke of dying with honor alongside comrades. In the camps, instructors told stories of soldiers who preferred death to surrender. The young men learned to view pain as a sign of strength and obedience as the highest virtue. Fear was not eliminated, but rather contained under the pressure of not failing the group. Sacrifice became an honorable destiny. Public ceremonies celebrated those who offered their lives for their country. At youth events, the names of those who fell in the First World War were commemorated, presented as eternal examples. Statues of soldiers killed in battle became sites of oath-taking for new recruits. Death was no longer a tragedy, it was the fulfillment of a mission. Children were taught to admire those who departed for their duty, even before fully understanding what it meant. The notion of individual future was subordinated to a supposed collective destiny. War was normalized as an inevitable prospect even before it began. Radio broadcasts spoke of constant threats from abroad. Newspapers described the country as surrounded by enemies. Military parades in the streets reinforced the feeling that the armies were not preparing for a potential conflict, but for a certain one. Drills, marches, anthems, and the glorification of the uniform fostered a state of heightened alert. For many young men, enlistment was not a break with their previous lives, but the natural continuation of a path already laid out in school. When war broke out, much of society was already predisposed to accept it as an expected stage. Soldiers marched to the front with bodies trained to bear the weight of their equipment and minds accustomed to unquestioning obedience. The military machine wasn't improvised in a few months. It had been slowly installed in daily life over years. Every step, from childhood games to military service, had transformed the citizen into a potential combatant. The boundary between civilian and soldier had blurred long before the first shot was fired. Total surveillance, the Gestapo and civilian life before the war. By 1936, Germany had become a laboratory for social control. The streets were clean, the trains ran on time, and posters displayed smiling faces alongside slogans about discipline, work, and patriotism. But beneath this orderly surface, a system of fear operated, reaching every corner of the country. The state had achieved something more effective than outright repression: self-surveillance. There was no need for a policeman on every corner. It was enough that every citizen feared every other. The Gestapo, founded in 1933 and absorbed by the SS in 1936, was the backbone of the new internal order. Unlike traditional police forces, it was not bound by laws or courts. It answered only to Himmler and, by extension, to the Führer. Its task was not to apprehend criminals but potential enemies of the regime, and the definition of enemy shifted depending on the circumstances. Its offices, located in ordinary buildings in Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg, employed a mere 7,000 agents, a surprisingly small number for controlling 70 million inhabitants. The secret of its effectiveness lay elsewhere: civilian collaboration. Denunciations fueled the system. In working-class neighborhoods, personal disputes were settled with an anonymous letter to the Gestapo. A sarcastic remark about the Führer, a joke about the bombing of Spain, or a comment about prices could be enough for a nighttime visit. In 1937, more than 80% of the cases opened by the political police came from ordinary citizens. It was an informal network of control where fear replaced trust. Neighbors, colleagues, and family members spied on each other. Betrayal became a form of self-protection. In homes, the state was present even in silence. The People's Radio, distributed cheaply by the Ministry of Propaganda, broadcast Goebbels and Hitler's speeches as if they were civic masses. Official voices dominated kitchens and factories. Listening to foreign stations was a crime. Schools became ideological trenches. Teachers had to swear allegiance to the Führer. Textbooks replaced mathematics with problems about ammunition and racial proportions. In classrooms, children repeated "one people, one Reich, one Führer." Childhood was militarized from rhyme to uniform. In the countryside, control was exercised with older symbols. Peasants were presented as the racial essence of the German people. The Hitler Youth organized agricultural work for students, portrayed as a patriotic sacrifice. The Blood and Soil program glorified rural life and demonized the city as a space of moral degeneration. In reality, it was a form of covert surveillance. Each village had its local hierarchy, and rural leaders reported on the behavior of their neighbors. Racial purity was also measured by silence. In the cities, modernity was subordinated to control. Cafes where politics and art had once been discussed were closed or converted into headquarters for the German Labour Front. Professional, sports, and cultural associations were absorbed into the party's corporate system. Leisure was planned. The Strength Through Joy program offered vacations, cruises, and shows, but it also served to test workers' loyalty. Those who did not participate were viewed with suspicion. Rest was another political duty. Fear wasn't always expressed through arrests. The mere rumor of an investigation was enough to destroy a life. The Gestapo didn't need to act in every case. Its power lay in the possibility of doing so. Every family had a story about someone who had disappeared without explanation: a teacher, a shopkeeper, a musician. The prisons were full of re-educated people, a term that replaced prisoners. Most were never tried. The law had ceased to be a limit, it had become an instrument. Jurists spoke of the Führer's will as a source of law. The propaganda machine reinforced this logic. Films depicted Aryan heroes, loyal peasants, fertile mothers, and impeccable soldiers. The press repeated figures of industrial growth and tales of economic miracles. By 1938, Germany had achieved full employment, an accomplishment that dazzled even critics of the regime. The arms industry, concealed behind civilian projects, had revitalized the country. Steel, engine, and synthetic rubber factories operated without pause. Military parades were interspersed with cultural festivals. It was the illusion of a society at peace preparing for war. Meanwhile, the repression became invisible. The concentration camps, initially created for political opponents, expanded and diversified. Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen functioned as centers of exemplary punishment. Communists, priests, homosexuals, and anyone who disturbed national unity were sent there. The SS documented every admission with bureaucratic precision. Internal reports spoke of re-education through labor, a formula that foreshadowed the future logic of extermination. In 1938, the night of November 9th marked a turning point. Kristallnacht was not a spontaneous outburst of violence, but a carefully orchestrated operation. In just a few hours, more than 250 synagogues were set ablaze, 7,500 Jewish businesses destroyed, and 30,000 people arrested. The streets littered with broken glass signaled the shift from social to state-sanctioned anti-Semitism. The population watched in silence. Many applauded, others hid. The Gestapo recorded the public's reaction. Most, one agent wrote, understand the necessity of the measures. Civilian life in the following months became a mixture of normalcy and suspicion. Shops reopened, cinemas filled up again, and schools taught that the elimination of foreign elements was part of the national rebirth. In port cities, families received letters from sons enlisting in the Navy or the Luftwaffe. No one spoke of politics. They talked about jobs, food, the new highways. The general feeling was one of pride and fear. The country seemed to be moving towards something inevitable, although few knew exactly what it was. In the spring of 1939, internal control reached its peak. Every factory, school, and office had a party delegate. Local authorities reported directly to Berlin. Union meetings were propaganda events. Censorship operated even before a word was written. Publishers knew what could not be printed. Artists either remained silent or emigrated. Scientists worked under military supervision. The state had colonized the collective mind. There was no room for doubt. In the working-class neighborhoods, the war was already palpable before it even began. Workshops were running double shifts, manufacturing ammunition and spare parts. The lines at the shops were longer, the prices higher. News from the Sudetenland, Austria and Czechoslovakia arrived shrouded in jubilation. When Hitler entered Prague in March 1939, many celebrated it as a bloodless diplomatic victory. No one imagined it was the prelude to a continental storm. Factories were producing tanks, but the newspapers spoke of peace. Radios broadcast marches, speeches and promises. Swastika flags waved from balconies. On trains, young soldiers waved goodbye amidst flowers. The Gestapo continued to observe, silent, taking notes, filing reports. In the cellars of Prince Albrechtstrasse, the cells were already prepared for a new category of enemies, wartime traitors. Fear had served its purpose. Germany was a perfectly synchronized society, a precision clock poised to keep moving forward without stopping. On September 1, 1939, when the cannons opened fire on Poland, the country was not surprised. It had been educated to obey, fueled by propaganda, and domesticated by the Gestapo. The factories were ready, the young men willing, the streets decorated. The regime had achieved its goal, to transform civilian life into a barracks. There was no transition because the war had already been raging within the Reich long before it began outside its borders. The war economy. Before the war, the metallic clang of machinery filled the factories even during what used to be rest hours. In many industrial centers, the lights stayed on all night while workers put in extended shifts. Posters on the walls reminded everyone that every piece produced strengthened the country. The noise of hammers and presses wasn't just an indicator of productivity, it was a sign that the economy had been aligned with a purpose greater than private profit. The state directed production with increasing precision. Companies that had previously competed in free markets were reorganized under centralized plans. The steel industry was made a priority sector, with production quotas set by state offices. Coal mines increased their activity and their workers were declared essential to the nation's future. Machine factories received massive orders for machinery with civilian uses but designed to be easily converted to military production. Trucks used for agricultural transport could be quickly transformed into logistics vehicles. The workforce was organized into a controlled structure. Workers registered with the German Labor Front were required to accept transfers to industrial sectors deemed strategic. Changing jobs ceased to be a personal decision. Working hours increased without proportional wage increases, justified by rhetoric of collective preparation. Factories incorporated state-run cafeterias, morning physical exercises, and brief speeches before the start of shifts. The figure of the boss was replaced by that of the ideological supervisor. Autarky was promoted as both a necessity and a virtue. The use of domestically produced synthetic materials was encouraged to replace imported goods. Artificial rubber emerged as a replacement for natural rubber. Fuel was obtained through chemical processes from coal. Propaganda presented each new material as a technological triumph, even if its performance was inferior to that of the originals. Consumers began to grow accustomed to lower quality fabrics and less durable products, convinced that they were contributing to strengthening the country's economic independence. The rationing system was tested gradually before its formal implementation. Some foods were deliberately made scarce to gauge public reaction. Campaigns to reduce waste were promoted, and pamphlets with simplified recipes using local ingredients were distributed. Housewives attended talks on how to manage food responsibly and with patriotic values. Posters appeared in markets and stores urging people to buy only what they needed to leave resources for other citizens. Austerity was extolled as a form of loyalty. Public investment was concentrated on infrastructure for strategic purposes. Civilian roads were designed to withstand the weight of armored vehicles. Bridges were reinforced to support entire convoys of military trucks. Large warehouses were built in areas far from urban centers to facilitate the storage of resources without attracting attention. Factories were located near railway lines adapted for the rapid transport of large volumes. These projects were presented as civilian initiatives, but they were driven by military logistics calculations. Wages remained stable while the prices of certain goods increased. Consumption was regulated through campaigns promoting self-control and extolling sacrifice. Newspapers published stories of families living modestly as examples of patriotism. Luxury was portrayed as a form of selfishness. Restaurants were monitored to prevent extravagance. Even fashion adhered to simple and austere designs. The economy not only changed its productive structure, but also shaped the daily habits of its citizens. Credit was redirected towards sectors linked to industrial and military development. Loans to small businesses deemed unproductive were restricted, while investments in heavy industry were facilitated. The purchase of government bonds was encouraged, presented as an act of participation in the nation's destiny. The population entrusted their savings with the hope of future rewards. Private money became fuel for state programs. Women's employment began to increase in secondary sectors, although officially it was emphasized that the home was their primary duty. Some women were hired to perform administrative or minor assembly tasks, always under supervision. Propaganda avoided presenting these activities as a professional career, instead offering them as temporary aid in consolidating the nation. The workforce was subtly reorganized, preparing for the possibility of a mass mobilization if needed. Foreign trade was restructured through bilateral agreements with countries that could provide necessary raw materials in exchange for manufactured goods. These exchanges avoided the use of foreign currency, allowing the country to maintain strategic reserves. Many treaties were negotiated discreetly and presented as signs of the country's growing economic prestige. Official figures exaggerated the increase in trade while concealing the growing dependence on resources essential for the future military machine. The economy no longer operated under market rules but under planned directives. Production was measured not in terms of profit but of strategic utility. Transportation, energy, and the chemical industry were declared vital sectors and treated as fronts of anticipated combat. Economic language adopted terms linked to discipline and battle. Much of the productive apparatus was already mobilized without having been officially declared when Poland was invaded. Workers were already operating as if they were in a state of emergency. Roads had already been built for mass movements. Materials were already slated for conversion. Restraint had already been tested. Society had already accepted living with less in order to produce more. The economy had learned to march before the army did. When war finally broke out, nothing happened by surprise. It wasn't the sudden explosion of an improvised system, but the natural consequence of a carefully assembled machine. After years of imposed discipline, indoctrinated childhoods, an economy tested for scarcity, controlled leisure, and fear administered as public policy, German society wasn't just ready for war, it had been molded for it. Every body, every factory, every word, and every silence had been made part of a cog that could no longer be stopped. The Reich didn't march toward war. It was already living within it before the first shot was fired. From illusion to iron, Germany, between 1936 and 1939. In 1936, Germany looked in the mirror and saw prosperity. The streets were filled with flags, parades were numerous, and the Berlin Olympics offered the world an image of order and modernity. Foreign visitors spoke of a reborn, proud and efficient country. On the radio, Goebbels' voice promised a bright future. In the factories, workers produced with enthusiasm, convinced that unemployment was a thing of the past. Propaganda spoke of unity and strength, but above all, people felt relief. After the Weimar famine and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was getting back on its feet. Fear existed, but it was diffuse. The Gestapo was already operating, but not everyone noticed it. Silence was a new custom that many accepted as part of the price of order. In the cities, culture still offered glimpses of normality. Concerts, cinemas, fairs, and sports clubs served as political havens. People talked about family, work, and progress. Politics had disappeared from conversations. The country seemed stable, prosperous, and clean. Young people marched proudly in the Hitler Youth, mothers received medals for having children, and workers received subsidized vacations through the Strength Through Joy program. The general feeling was one of confidence. 3 years later, in 1939, that confidence had transformed into discipline. What had been enthusiasm in 1936 was now obligation. The parades continued, but they no longer had the festive air of the early years. They were demonstrations of power. Radio, omnipresent, broadcast slogans every hour. Laughter was shorter, conversations more cautious. The country functioned like a machine under strain. No one spoke of politics, not even in a whisper. Anonymous denunciations had turned friendship into a risk. Homes maintained the same order, but no longer the same calm. The shop windows were still full, but prices were rising. The trains, which once carried tourists, now carried troops. Factories worked double shifts. The workers slept less, ate quickly, and spoke little. Women replaced the mobilized men. In schools, the hanging maps showed a larger Reich: Austria, the Sudetenland, Bohemia. Children learned to march and sing military hymns. The air was thick with triumph, but also with tension. No one knew when or where the war would begin, but everyone knew it was coming. In 1936, Germany felt admired. In 1939, it felt watched. Pride had been replaced by surveillance. The national unity, celebrated in the squares, was now sustained by fear. At night, the sound of uniformed footsteps was no longer a spectacle, it was a warning. The same streets illuminated by torches in the Olympic parades were now preparing to go dark at the sound of sirens. The country that had promised greatness had achieved something else entirely: absolute silence.